The Titanic carried 3,300 passengers and crew. Nearly half of them lost their lives on the night of April 14, 1912. But the stories of the Titanic live on. On the ship were millionaires, artists, fashionistas, bakers, cookers, musicians, doctors, and con men. These are their stories. Welcome to the Last Night on the Titanic podcast. All right, well, this is the final episode in our series, and I think it's worth taking a little bit of time to reflect on what this all means. We looked at different stories of people. We looked at different recipes that go along with their lives, and we see this full spectrum of humanity here, from incredible bravery, self-sacrifice, encouragement of others in the face of death, and then you see cowardice, you see manipulation, you see the best, the worst, and everything else in between. Veronica, I'd just like to know, for you, when you were researching the story, and I think really digging into it, what did you get personally out of researching the Titanic story in depth that you hope others can get out of it by looking at this story?
Scott, I found so much strength through so many of these survivors, and even through some of those that did not survive, but in the way they fought for their lives. And, one of the best examples is Charles Jockin. And he's the baker who we would probably immediately recognize in the films, the James Cameron Titanic film and the 1950s movie, A Night to Remember, where we see this baker with a baker cap on and a bottle of whiskey in his hand, trying to hang on for dear life. And the real story is much more somber and sobering. And, I think there's just that little bit of a character in him that Hollywood, really took and ran with. But the inspiring things that I found were things like what he did in the face of certain death, almost certain death, at least as far as he knew at the time. He did survive, but he decided to take action. He said to himself, or he asked himself, what can I do to help myself? His fate was one that was extremely unjust. He had been assigned a lifeboat assignment as a crew member to row it and direct it. And when it came time for that boat to launch, he, for some reason, was not given the command to board. And this was a very top-down type of environment. This was not a kind of environment where an employee would push back. A life at sea. And he immediately started to throw deck chairs into the water from the deck because he was thinking on his feet, what's going to happen to me when I'm out there in those icy waters? Maybe if I throw these deck chairs overboard, all of them, there might be one I can hold on to when I get in there. And so I was really just inspired time and again by these people that held on, people who came together in the most terrible situations. And when they could have talked about anything, they wanted to say the Lord's Prayer together. And together they recited the Lord's Prayer. I mean, it's just an amazing collaboration, a confluence of beautiful, inspiring stories.
And I want to return to something that we discussed at the very beginning of this series when I was asking about any recipes that you think gave you insight into the past and you feel like you were being transported back to the past. And one that you mentioned specifically was tripe soup. When you had that, or maybe any other recipes, did you somehow feel like you could get a sense of what it was like to be a person on third class, or if you were having a fancy dessert that isn't commonly served anymore, that somehow that helped you understand what it was like to be a Edwardian trendsetter, or any other perspective that this food or drink may have given you?
Yes, it absolutely did. I mean, when you hear the word tripe, you're looking at this topic, looking at steerage food. I mean, it just takes you there. And gruel was on the menu too, which was it's like a porridge, but it's a little more watery. But one of the most significant things that really impressed me, was impressed upon me, was the fact that the White Star Line, as an English company, chose to, and I'm sure it was not a tough choice, I'm sure it was a no-brainer for them at the time, they chose to hire a concessionaire to come in and manage their best restaurants on what was at the time the most fabulous ship in the world and one of the most fabulous ships in history. And they did that because they wanted authentic French food and French cooks and chefs. And they wanted that because at that time, French food was it was not to be beaten. Okay, the waters have really evened out. The playing fields have really evened out nowadays. But back then, it was just a given that you were going to have to bring in French chefs to entertain these passengers at a scale with which they were accustomed. So that to me really stood out because, we take it for granted these days that there are just such incredible English chefs and British chefs. Some of the ones that are included in the cookbook, there's Connor McClelland is phenomenal, Emmett McCourt. There's, so many different people who have really changed English cuisine, where today when a ship is sailing, there's no question about it. It's going to be, English cooking. It's just a very different culture these days. But it wasn't like that back in 1912.
Well, here's a question I think to wrap up the series, and something that I think about a lot when I think about things that happened a long time ago in the past. There's no one alive from that event anymore. And this is true for the Titanic, where it sunk over 100 years ago. The last survivor passed away over a decade ago, but it still seems to have emotional resonance with people. The Civil War is another example of something that does, and that's not true of all events in history. Some things are really only of interest to scholars, and there's no emotional connection to it. The Titanic seems to have that. Why do you think that is? And you wrote a book about the Titanic. Why do you think people should still know about the story today? And what would they get out of it?
Well, I think the intrigue in Titanic, I've thought about this a lot, and I think it's due to the fact that, this was, today we would call it the perfect storm. It was a confluence of some of the most incredible people in history. Just to name a few, one of the founders of Macy's was on board. John Jacob Astor IV, the founder of the Knickerbocker and St. Regis hotels, which are still vibrant, amazing places contributing to society today. And there were just dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of trendsetters and people who were, everyone we've talked about on this series, during the series from fashion designers of the day, the best of the best of the best. And they were all in one place on that night when one of the most unthinkable things happens. The ship strikes an iceberg, and, for a complete other set of unthinkable circumstances, one being a fire had been raging since they left Southampton, and the iceberg just happened to hit right where that area was where the fire was raging. And, we knew about that back in 1912, Scott. That was in the papers. And recently it resurfaced, and, people assumed that was news that had just been uncovered. This story is just, it is just full of things to be learned from. And I think from me as a food journalist, spent many years studying and writing about food. The most key thing for me, of course, is the look at what were people eating back then. When I covered the Olympics in 2008, the first thing I asked Michael Phelps, what do you eat every day? That's how a food reporter thinks. And, in this case, it's looking at how those things show us what life was like. The complicated recipes that they worked with, and the way they ate at the dinner table, all the different silverware and table settings that they had, all the different customs. There was even a bugler on board who would call people to dinner by bugling the song, "The Roast Beef of Old England." It was a event to go to dinner every night, at least in third class and probably second as well. And actually, I'm going to say in steerage as well. I think The Edwardians, as I mentioned to you before, they're definitely reminding us that we're not the first foodies.
All right. Well, thank you for giving us all these stories, and thank you for compiling all these recipes and everything else and giving us this new perspective on the Titanic.
Well, and thank you for giving this even further legs through the internet.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope it really reaches out to people. And if people want to follow up, this isn't the end of the story. I hope it's the beginning for a lot of people. They can, of course, check out Veronica's book and go to the show notes for this series as well, where you can find all the recipes and everything else. Try it out for yourself, and hope you enjoy it. Thanks for listening to the Last Night on the Titanic podcast. To listen to all the episodes in the series, go to lastnightonthetitanicpodcast.com. There you'll also find show notes, biographical profiles of the passengers and crew on the Titanic, and recipes for all the recipe spotlights that we do in the series. One last thing, if you like the show, please rate and review it on the podcast listener of your choice. Thanks again for listening, and see you next time.